Humanity had always assumed peace was the default state of the universe and war was the interruption. It took 200 years and one funeral to learn it had always been the other way around. The Osuri didn't look like guardians. They looked like geology that had learned to walk, tall, crystalline beings the color of wet slate, moving so slowly that human toddlers could outrun them, speaking in sentences that sometimes took an entire afternoon to finish. They perceived time the way humans perceived weather. Something vast, slow-moving, and only worth reacting to over the course of seasons. Not minutes. When they'd first arrived, humanity had assumed the Osuri were simply harmless. Interesting neighbors. Slow, gentle rock people who liked to sit in gardens and occasionally offer advice so oblique it took committees years to decode. Nobody had assumed the Osuri were the only reason humanity was still alive. Dr. Amara Voss had spent 11 years as the human liaison to Threndel, the eldest Osuri ambassador on Earth, and in that time, she had learned exactly one hard rule: never rush him. She sat now on the stone bench across from him, watching moss creep almost imperceptibly along his shoulder, the way it had for as long as she'd known him. His voice, when it came, arrived like tectonic movement, slow, layered, unhurried. "You seem troubled, Amara," Threndel said. It took him nearly a full minute to finish the sentence. "I read the quarterly threat assessments this morning," she said. Border sensors picked up unusual movement past the Kestrel line again. "Command's worried." Threndel's crystalline features shifted, the Osuri equivalent she'd learned of something between a smile and a sigh. "Command worries about a decade. I worry about a century. We are not measuring the same thing. That's not comforting, Threndel." "It is not meant to comfort," he said. "It is meant to be true. I have been managing that border for 194 of your years, Amara. It is not unusual movement. It is a pattern I set in place before your grandmother was born." Amara sat back, startled, not for the first time, but never used to it. "Managing it how?" Threndel's answer took almost 3 minutes to complete, and Amara had learned by now to simply wait. "There is an empire beyond the Kestrel line," he said finally, "that has wanted this system for longer than your species has had writing. They do not move quickly. Neither do we. It has been for 2 centuries a very long, very quiet game of patience, played across a table neither side of you has ever been permitted to see. You've been protecting us, this whole time." "I have been delaying an inevitability," Threndel corrected gently. "Long enough for you to grow strong enough to survive it yourselves. That was always the arrangement I made with myself, long before your species had a name for me." Amara felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Made with yourself, not with us." "You were not ready to carry the weight of the true timeline, Amara. Rushing a species toward a truth it cannot yet hold is, in my experience, the fastest way to break it." She wanted to be angry. She found instead that she couldn't be, not looking at him, ancient and patient and entirely without malice, a being who had spent 2 centuries quietly standing between humanity and something it didn't even know to fear. "How much longer?" she asked carefully. "Were you planning to hold that line?" For the first time in 11 years, Threndel didn't answer immediately. His crystalline shoulders, weathered by 2 centuries of careful, invisible war, seemed to settle lower than she had ever seen them. "I am 931 years old, Amara," he said at last. "The Osuri do not fear death. We fear leaving unfinished work behind for hands too young to hold it." He reached into a fold of stone-colored robe and produced a small sealed data crystal, offering it to her with hands that, for the first time she could remember, trembled very slightly. "I had hoped for another decade," he said. "I no longer believe I will have it. This contains everything, Amara. Every treaty I never told your governments about. Every quiet concession, every long game, every lie I told your enemies to buy your species time to grow teeth of your own." A pause, achingly long. "I'm sorry. I always meant to finish the game myself." 3 days later, Threndel died in the sunken garden, sitting exactly where he always sat, as unhurried in death as he had been in every other moment of his impossibly long life. The chamber wasn't silent from shock this time. It was silent from something closer to vertigo, the particular quiet of 300 people learning, all at once, that the ground they'd been standing on had never actually been solid. Amara stood at the podium, The data crystal's contents now projected across every screen in the chamber. 2 centuries of hidden diplomacy, forged concessions, quietly sabotaged supply lines, entire wars prevented so subtly that no human government had ever known there was a war to prevent. He wasn't an advisor, Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. He was the entire eastern border. For 200 years, every time command wondered why the Kestrel frontier stayed quiet. It stayed quiet because a single Osirai ambassador was personally, invisibly, holding it shut. The Kenyan delegate, gray-haired now, who had stood in this same chamber decades ago for an entirely different alien war, spoke first. And now he's dead. And now he's dead, Amara confirmed. And the Empire on the other side of that border has just noticed the hand on the door has let go. Nobody moved to vote on a declaration of war this time. There was no atrocity to answer, no footage to avenge, just a slow, sinking, collective understanding that humanity had spent 2 centuries mistaking someone else's patience for their own safety. The German delegate finally broke the silence. Then we finish what he started. What did he leave us? Amara looked down at the data crystal. A plan, 200 years in the making. He didn't just delay the invasion, gentlemen. He set a trap for it, piece by piece, treaty by treaty, decade by decade. And he ran out of time to spring it himself. She looked up at the room. He left us the final move. We just have to be fast enough for once to make it in time. Humanity did not have 200 years to prepare. It had, according to Threndel's final projections, 11 days before the Empire beyond the Kestrel line noticed the silence where their old adversary used to be and moved to fill it. The plan Threndel left behind wasn't a weapon. It was worse in the specific way only a 2-century Khan could be. A network of Osirai-brokered treaties, secretly signed by 3 neighboring empires who each believed they alone held a private alliance with the ancient ambassador. None of them knew about the others. All of it, Threndel's notes explained with an almost apologetic thoroughness, had been designed to activate at once. The instant humanity sent the correct signal down channels the Osirai had spent 200 years quietly building and never once mentioning to a single human government. He built us an alliance, Amara said, staring at the tangle of treaty seals now unfolding across her monitor, out of enemies who don't know they're allies, for 200 years, and never told a single human soul it existed. Can we even activate it? Admiral Reyes Ose asked. Dana's granddaughter, 3 wars removed from a name that still meant something in the history archives. None of these empires have ever spoken to Earth directly. We don't activate it as Earth, Amara said, reading Threndel's final instructions again, slower this time, the way he always would have wanted her to. We activate it as him. His authorization codes, his voice print, synthesized from 2 centuries of diplomatic recordings. As far as 3 empires are concerned, for the length of one signal, Threndel isn't dead at all. The signal went out at the exact hour the Kestrel Line invasion fleet crossed into contested space. A voice 2 centuries in the making, layered and unhurried and unmistakably, achingly familiar to 3 separate empires who had each spent generations believing they alone held his trust. None of them saw the others respond. None of them needed to. The invasion fleet that crossed the Kestrel Line expecting an empty, undefended frontier instead found itself within the hour, quietly flanked by 3 separate armadas that had never once cooperated in living memory, each acting on private assurances from an ambassador none of them knew was already dead. There was no great human battle. No tungsten railguns, no boarding parties. Just an old patient trap, sprung exactly on schedule by hands too young to have built it, closing on an empire that had spent 2 centuries waiting for a door that was never going to open again. The moss had grown back over the bench where Threndel used to sit, slow and unhurried, exactly the way he would have wanted it to. Amara sat there now, an old data crystal resting empty in her palm, its contents long since folded into treaties actually signed by actual governments. Humanity's own patient work, finally begun, 2 centuries later than it should have started. A young Osirai, barely 2 decades old and already taller than any human would ever be, settled onto the stone beside her with the particular unhurried grace of a species that measured time in centuries rather than days. "You are still troubled," the young Osirai observed. It took her almost a full minute to finish the sentence. "I keep wondering," Amara said, How much longer he meant to carry it,